All right, so today we're going to be diving deep into the American Revolution. Powdered wigs, declarations, all that good stuff. But before we get to all that drama, we really need to understand what even led to it. What were the things bubbling under the surface before everything exploded?
Yeah, that's the really interesting part. Revolutions don't just appear out of nowhere. They're built on, well, sometimes years of simmering tension and discontent. And for the American Revolution, one of the big ones was, you guessed it, taxes. Or, more specifically, taxation without representation.
Oh, right, yeah. No taxation without representation. That's like the classic American Revolution slogan. But what did that actually mean for the colonists? What was it like to live through that?
Okay, so imagine this. You're being told you have to pay taxes, but you have absolutely zero say in the government. No representatives, no way to actually change anything. Frustrating, right?
Totally. It's like a basic, right, just totally ignored. And I feel like it wasn't even just about the money itself, was it?
Exactly. It was about power, about autonomy. The colonists felt like they were being treated like, I don't know, second-class citizens, just told what to do by a distant empire that didn't care. And of course, from the British side, they had just fought the 7 Years' War, which was expensive, so they saw the colonies as a way to, get some of that money back.
Ah, the 7 Years' War. That was something you mentioned in your notes, right? Seems like understanding that is crucial for understanding why things went wrong between Britain and the colonies.
Oh, absolutely. The 7 Years' War was this global conflict, really drained Britain's resources. So they look at these prosperous colonies, and it's like, well, there's money to be made there. But the colonists, well, they saw that as pure exploitation.
Right, so you've got this tension, this resentment just building and building. And then Britain decides to impose these new taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, those are the ones that our sources highlight as really lighting the fuse.
And these weren't just theoretical laws. They impacted daily life. Like the Stamp Act. It forced colonists to pay a tax on, well, everything printed. Legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards.
Playing cards, seriously,
Yeah.
that's just adding insult to injury. I can see why people were angry.
Yeah. It was seen as an attempt to control information, to
Yeah.
shut down any opposition. And then came the Townshend Acts, taxes on imported goods, tea, glass, paint, all these everyday things. And colonial merchants hit them hard. It just fanned the flames of rebellion even more.
Okay, so we got this frustrated population feeling the squeeze from these taxes. What did they do? Did they just sit back and take it?
Nope, not at all. They started organizing, protesting, that slogan, no taxation without representation. That wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a real rallying cry bringing people together.
So we're starting to see a movement take shape here. And I have a feeling it's about to get even more dramatic, right?
You could say that. All this unrest eventually leads to a pretty tragic confrontation.
The Boston Massacre. Ah, the Boston Massacre. I mean, the name itself just evokes chaos and violence. What happened there?
So it started with a pretty small argument. Colonists and a British soldier guarding a customs house. Tensions rose, a crowd gathered, and, well, things got out of control.
It sounds tense, but how does a minor argument become a massacre?
Well, that's where the details get a bit murky. Accounts from each side differ, but what we do know is British soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 colonists died.
5 people. I mean, today that might not seem like a lot, but in a small colonial city.
It was devastating. And news spread fast, fueled by, passionate accounts from both sides, became a symbol of British tyranny, further galvanized the resistance. There were investigations and trials, but the damage was done. Things between colonists and British authorities, they were broken.
Okay, so things are getting serious now. Resentment, organized protests, a deadly confrontation. What happened next?
Did the colonists just jump right into revolution? Not quite yet. But there was another major event that really poured gasoline on the fire, something you might be familiar with. The Boston Tea Party.
Ah, yes. The Boston Tea Party. Colonists dressed as Native Americans dumping tea into Boston Harbor. It's such an iconic image. But was it really all about tea?
Well, not really. It was a protest against the Tea Act, which, on the surface, it lowered the price of tea, but it actually gave the British East India Company a monopoly. Full control.
So it was about more than just a cup of tea. It was about control of the colonial economy, the right to free trade.
Exactly. And it sent a clear message to Britain. The colonists were serious. They were willing to take action, bold action, to protect their interests. It wasn't just the tea, it was the principle.
It's fascinating how these seemingly small acts of defiance, these symbolic gestures, can have such a huge impact, like a domino effect. One thing leads to another and pushes the colonies closer and closer to revolution.
That's a great way to put it. And the Boston Tea Party was definitely a turning point. Showed the British that the colonists, they weren't messing around. They were ready to fight for what they believed in.
All right, so the stage is set for a showdown. Frustration, organized resistance, a deadly confrontation, a bold act of defiance. What was the final spark? What actually started the war?
That came in April 1775 with battles of Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world. It was the moment all those simmering tensions finally boiled over into armed conflict.
This is where things get really interesting. We're officially at war. And I'm guessing the colonists, even though they were totally outmatched, were determined to fight for their beliefs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lexington and Concord, that was the point of no return. It was the beginning of a long and bloody fight for independence. And the colonists, well, they were ready to face anything to win their freedom.
So we left off with, the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think what those first days must have been like for those colonists, going up against the mighty British Empire. Like, talk about an underdog story.
It really is. I mean, think about it. They didn't even have a unified army, no real central government. The odds were stacked against them, but they were willing to risk it all for independence.
In your notes, you mentioned being interested in the leaders who, emerged during this time. Was there anyone who really stood out to you?
Well, you can't really talk about the American Revolution without talking about George Washington. He was, incredible. A skilled military leader, charismatic. He really rallied his troops. He became the symbol of the revolution.
Yeah, his image is just so iconic. Leading troops across the Delaware that winter, Valley Forge, tough times. It's hard to picture the revolution without him, right?
Definitely. Washington brought stability, leadership, when it was really needed. But of course, he wasn't alone. So many other people played crucial roles.
Oh, like who? Give me some names.
Well, there's John Adams, brilliant legal mind, super passionate about independence, and, well, let's be honest, a bit of a hothead. He was crucial for drafting the Declaration of Independence and getting other countries to support the revolution. And then there's Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, visionary leader, big on individual liberty.
The Declaration of Independence, another one of those iconic, American Revolution things. It wasn't just like a breakup letter to King George, was it?
No way. It was about principles, a statement that all men are created equal, that they have these unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness.
Powerful stuff. And they still resonate with people all over the world today. It makes sense that it inspired so many other revolutions, right?
Exactly. It was groundbreaking, challenging those traditional hierarchies, saying people have the right to govern themselves.
But declaring independence is one thing, actually winning against a superpower like Britain, that's another. What were some of the biggest challenges they faced?
Well, for one, they were totally outmatched. Manpower, resources, military experience. The Continental Army was mostly just like ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, going up against a real professional army.
I can only imagine how daunting that must have felt. But they had some advantages too, right?
Oh, for sure. They were fighting on their own land, knew the terrain, and probably most important, they had the support of the people.
We've been talking about the big names, the battles, but what about everyday life during the revolution? What was it like for, just regular people?
Oh, that's a good question. Life was, well, anything but normal. It was a time of constant uncertainty, never knowing who to trust, what might happen next. Families were torn apart, loyalties tested, and the threat of violence was always there.
Did any of your research, bring those personal stories to life?
Definitely. Diaries, letters from back then, they paint a really vivid picture of the challenges, the sacrifices people made. Women, for example, they were essential, managing farms, businesses, making supplies. Some even served as spies and soldiers.
That's amazing. They were the unsung heroes, for sure. And speaking of unsung heroes, what about African Americans during the war?
Well, the revolution had a huge impact on enslaved people. Many saw it as a chance to fight for their own freedom. Thousands joined the Continental Army, fighting bravely, hoping their service would lead to emancipation.
It's a reminder that, the fight for freedom and equality, it had many layers back then.
Absolutely. The revolution was complex, contradictory. It had these ideals of liberty and equality. But at the same time, you had slavery still existing.
Yeah, it's a bit sobering. Even revolutions don't always, live up to their own ideals.
Exactly. The American Revolution was crucial, but it was just the beginning of a much longer fight for a truly just society. And that fight, well, it continues today.
So we've got these colonists, they're fighting for their independence, going through incredible hardships, but ultimately they win. When did things start to turn in their favor? What were the key moments?
There were a few, but the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, that was a big one. A major victory for the Continental Army and a real turning point.
What made Saratoga so important?
Well, first, it was a huge morale boost. But maybe more importantly, it convinced France to officially join the war. On the American side.
Ah, the French. That changes everything, right? Having a major power like France backing them up, that must have been huge.
Oh, yeah, it was. French military and financial help, they were crucial for the Americans to win.
So the French are on board, momentum is shifting, the British are feeling the heat. What was the final straw? What led to their defeat?
That came in 1781, the Battle of Yorktown. A brilliant victory for the Americans, led by Washington, with help from the French Army and Navy. The British, they were trapped, outnumbered, had to surrender.
Wow, what a moment. Yorktown basically ended the war, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
There were still some smaller fights, some negotiations to work out, but Yorktown, that was a decisive victory. American independence was basically secured.
So they did it. They beat one of the most powerful empires in the world, created a new nation based on self-governance, individual liberty. It's an incredible achievement. But what happened next? What were the long-term effects of this whole revolution?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Winning independence, that was just the first step, the real challenge. Creating a new government, a new system that actually reflected those revolutionary ideals.
That's true. Saying all men are created equal is one thing. Actually living up to it, building a society around it, that's much harder. What did that process look like?
Well, it was messy. There were big debates, different visions, a lot of strong personalities, all wanting to shape things. Remember those founding fathers we talked about? Well, they didn't always agree.
You know, that makes them seem more human, relatable. They were just real people trying to figure out some really tough problems.
Exactly. And from that messy, passionate process, we got the United States Constitution. Really a groundbreaking document, a blueprint for a new kind of nation.
The Constitution. You marked that as really important in your research. What makes it so special?
Well, first off, it created this system of checks and balances, so no one part of the government gets too powerful. It also laid out basic rights and freedoms in the Bill of Rights. Things like freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches.
Those are rights we take for granted now, but back then, they were radical. It's kind of mind-blowing that words written so long ago still shape our lives today.
It really shows the power of those ideas. But it's important to remember, the Constitution wasn't perfect. It was a compromise, reflecting the time it was created in.
You're talking about slavery, right? How could a nation built on liberty and equality allow slavery to continue?
It was a huge contradiction, right at the heart of the American experiment. The Founding Fathers, many were slaveholders themselves, they struggled with this, but they just couldn't or wouldn't solve it. They left it for future generations to figure out.
A reminder that even revolutions have limits. They can create big changes, but they can't fix every problem, especially deep social and economic ones, instantly.
Right. The American Revolution was a turning point, but it was just the start of a long fight for a more just and equal world. And that fight, well, it's still going on today.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the American Revolution, what's the one thing you want our listeners to think about?
I think it's important to remember that revolutions, they're not just things of the past. They're still happening. Those ideals for the American Revolution, liberty, equality, self-determination, they still inspire people all over the world. And it's up to every generation to keep those ideals alive, to keep working towards a better world.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, as you think about this revolution, ask yourself, what does freedom mean to you? What role will you play in shaping the future? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the American Revolution. Until next time.
Okay, so we've gone from unhappy colonists to the British surrendering at Yorktown. It's kind of amazing they actually won their independence. But like with any revolution, the story, well, it doesn't just end there, right? So what happened next? What happened to the nation they built out of all that? That's when things get really interesting. Because winning independence, well, it was just the first step, the hard part. Creating a new government, a whole new system that actually lived up to those revolutionary ideals.
Right. Yeah. It's easy to say all men are created equal, but actually building a whole society around that, that's got to be tough. What was that like?
It was, messy. Lots of arguments, different ideas about how things should work, tons of big personalities all trying to, have their say. Remember those founding fathers we talked about? Yeah, they didn't always agree.
Actually, that's kind of reassuring, right? Makes them seem more real, like they were just regular people trying to solve some really, really difficult problem.
Exactly. And out of all that chaos, all that passion, came the United States Constitution. Really a groundbreaking document, like a blueprint for this brand new kind of nation.
The Constitution. Now, that was a document you marked as, like, really important in your research. What makes it so special?
Well, for one, it created this whole system of checks and balances to make sure that no one part of the government gets too much